Alongside the historical and more general wargaming content I've been recording for my Road to Leipzig series, I thought it would be helpful to draw together everything I've learned from far too many books on Prussian uniforms, and record a series of painting guides for the army. What better place to start than with the Perry's box of Napoleonic Prussian Line Infantry. This will have you covered for all the Musketeer battalions in the Line Infantry regiments numbered 1 through 11 in July 1813. Sorry, 2nd Brandenburg Regiment. Plus their Fusilier battalions, through the addition of the Perry's metal conversion set, featuring different packs and command figures, and, if you feel like painting on some moustaches, the Grenadier battalions as well. So, onto the guide. This is an NCO figure that I'll be painting to a high tabletop standard in the facing colours of the 2nd West Prussian Regiment. I begin from a black undercoat, and I'm a devotee of the traditional 3-stage method of base, shade and highlights. On screen now are the colours you'll need from the Citadel paint range for the Basecoats. You may also want a mix of hair colours to use across the regiment, things like Thondia Brown, Gawthor Brown, Baneblade Brown and Sandry Dust. In addition, depending on which regiment you're painting, you may also need a further 1 or 2 paints from the tables shown below for the unit facings and shoulder straps, all of which I'll go through in due course. We begin with Dawnstone Grey, since it's the colour with the most coverage on the miniature. I apply this all over the trousers, being careful not to cover up the model's gaiters, which begin just below the knee, or the leather sheath around the greatcoat roll, worn over the left shoulder. Next, in Cantor Blue, I paint his collet, or double-breasted jacket, being sure to pick out the buttoned panel down the centre of the Brandenburg cuff, but avoiding the straps across the torso, the collar, shoulder straps, and turnbacks on the sides of the coattails. Using Rakarth Flesh, I paint anything that's going to be white or linen. That includes the sword knot, to which we'll add the correct details in colour later on. The linen haversack, one on the left hip. The pouch for the mess tin. And a little strap which fastens the top of the knapsack shut. Since this model is a musketeer, I'm also painting the small tie around the ends of the greatcoat roll, and all the straps across the centre of the body in this colour. This would be the same for a Grenadier, but for Fusiliers, most of those straps are in black. The only exception being the thin one running from his right shoulder to his left hip for the haversack. I prefer to do the smaller areas next. First, in XV88, I pick out that leather sheath on the greatcoat. This extends just either side of the shoulder, and was in fact designed as a cover for the musket lock, but you'll see it being repurposed in this way across illustrations of pretty much all Prussian line infantry of the time. Next, using Dryad bark, I cover the wood on the gun stock and along the body of the musket. Then, with Rhinox hide, I do the leather scabbard for the sabre, in the case of musketeers, or falchion for Fusiliers, plus the main calfskin body of the knapsack. I use lead belcher for the metalwork, starting with the buttons on the sides of the gaiters, as well as the barrel, bayonet, and lock on the musket. By this point it was the M1809 model that was standard in the Prussian line, but shortages were such that all manner of other captured and salvaged muskets could be found among the ranks, alongside older versions of the Potsdam musket. You'll notice that the barrel is attached to the stock with 3 brass rings, which I paint in Balthasar gold, along with a plate on the butt of the musket. Other bits of brass include the grip and guard on the sidearm, the chape at the end of the scabbard, and the buttons found on the shoulder strap, down the centre of the collet, and on the cuffs. In addition, Musketeers and Grenadiers have an oval brass plate on the flap of the black leather cartridge pouch. This is absent for Fusiliers. If you have the Perry conversion set with alternative metal packs to glue onto the plastic figures, then you'll see they're sculpted without that plate. But if you want to go cheaper and simpler route, then you could just paint over it in black, or scrape it off, I guess. If I'm being honest, the pouch probably shouldn't even be there for an NCO if he's got the smaller cartridge pouch to his front. But this is the intended pack for the sculpt, as seen in the 3-ups which the Perrys shared when originally sculpting the set. You can tell this as well because the 2 packs on the command sprue without a cartridge pouch also lack a haversack, being intended for the bodies of the musician and standard bearer, both of whom have their haversacks sculpted onto the right hip. Skin next, in Cadian flesh tone. Right, onto the facing colours. This can get complicated quickly, so if you're interested in a more thorough explanation of how these are all organised, then I have an entire separate video on the topic, linked in the corner now. For the sake of brevity, here is a cheat sheet. If you have a certain regiment in mind that you want to paint, look at its provincial designation in the second column. So in the case of the 7th Infantry Regiment, that is West Prussia. Then pick out the corresponding paint, being Mephiston red. This goes for Musketeers, Fusiliers and Grenadiers alike. For Regiments 8 and 9, the Leip and Kolberg regiments, look at the provinces in square brackets after their honorific titles. Yes, I know that I list the same paint for Crimson and Poppy Red. In short, red can be a nuisance. Mephiston red works. Anyway, I'll make the distinction between these two reds when it comes to highlights. The interpretation and appearance of these two colours in particular is a rabbit hole of its own, one which I address in the aforementioned facings video at some length. Depending on your own views on the topic, corn red or even screamer pink might appeal more for the West Prussians. Enough, I said I'd keep this brief. With paint in hand, start to pick out the figure's collar and cuffs with the correct colour. For shoulder straps, it's back to our table. This time, look at the ordinal number next to the provincial designation of your chosen regiment. For instance, 2nd West Prussian. This denotes the regiment's seniority, which corresponds to the colour used on its shoulder straps. White for 1st, red for 2nd, and in the case of East Prussia, yellow for 3rd, blue for 4th. Grenadiers fought as combined battalions drawn from two separate infantry regiments of the same province. With the West Prussian Grenadier Battalion, for instance, that is unsurprisingly the 1st and 2nd West Prussian infantry regiments. This means that while their collars and cuffs would all share the same colour, half the battalion would have shoulder straps in white, and the other half in red. In the case of East Prussia, with their 4 regiments to draw from, just note that for the 2nd East Prussian Grenadier Battalion, the correct shoulder strap colours are yellow for one half the battalion, and blue for the other half. Regardless of whatever colour you require for facings and shoulder straps, you will need some Mephiston red at least for the turnbacks of the coat tails, if visible on your sculpt, and the red leather strap on the musket. Since this figure is an NCO, we have a few extra details to add at this stage as well. If you look closely at the sculpt, you'll see a trim detailed around the edge of the cuff and collar. This would have been in gold lace. I used Balthazar gold again. Right, back to something straightforward. Abaddon black. I use this for the gaiters, boots, cartridge pouch, strap attaching the mess tin to the knapsack, the oilskin on his shako, and its strap. If you are unlucky to get any paint on it earlier, you might also need to pick out the little exposed portion of his undershirt just below the chin. Remember that in the case of Fusiliers, you might also need to touch up the straps across the torso in black, plus the tie around the end of the greatcoat roll, just beside his right wrist. And finally, the hair. I like to use a mix of colours across a regiment, such as Dryad Bark, Gawthor Brown, Zandri Dust, Abaddon Black, and so on. Musketeers and Fusiliers were clean shaven, but Grenadiers sported a moustache. If you don't feel like painting one on, I suppose you could try and cobble together a bunch of spare heads from the Perry's Allied Cavalry set with their moulded facial hair to use on your figures. So there we have all of our base coats. Once you've tidied everything up, I apply an all-over wash of Agrax Earthshade. With something like Napoleonics, when you're painting up so many of them, I don't see the harm in shading the entire figure at once in this way. If you do want to be more selective with a blue shade, a black one, a skin tone and so on, then be my guest. With the wash all dried, it's on to highlights. To speed things up, you can of course just skip a good number of these steps if you want, but in case you do that, remember I was saving the colours on the sword knot until this section of the video, so at least check out the timestamp for those. Here are the colours I use for these stages. Note, by the way, that GW's paint graphic for Ulthuan Grey is quite a bit more blue than the paint itself. I really like this colour as a substitute for a pure white on uniforms, one which avoids any problems with chalkiness that you might experience with other paints. Okay, greys first. I begin with Dawnstone, just returning most areas of the trousers and greatcoat roll back to our mid-tone, while being sure to avoid the recesses where the shade has gathered. Then, in Administratum Grey, pick out the highlights on any edges and raised areas. It's a very similar process for the blues. Begin with Cantor Blue for those mid-tones, followed by Altdorf Guard Blue for the highlights. Anything in linen, like the haversack and mess tin cover, I just leave alone. The shade over Rakarth flesh seems to do the job. Bits in white though, so the straps for Musketeers and Grenadiers, as well as the sword knot, I brighten up with Ulthuan Grey. For the detail on the sword knot, the exact colours and their placement varies according to the company and battalion of the figure that you're painting. Behold, some diagrams I've created in PowerPoint. Musketeers and Fusiliers first. Which part of the sword knot is coloured is dictated by the number or type of battalion, so 1st Musketeers, 2nd Musketeers, or Fusiliers. The colour then changes with each company within the battalion. Green for 1st, yellow for 2nd, blue for 3rd, red for 4th, with the exception of the 1st company in the 1st battalion, whose entire sword knot was in white. Note that my diagram here is correct for the 1st Battalion, per the AKO on the 14th of November 1808, where it is all laid out. This runs contrary to many diagrams that have appeared in published uniform guides. Again, it's something I address in the facings video if you want the full story. Link in the description. For Grenadiers, no colours used, just black. But this time the part varies for each company. Remember that these were combined Grenadier battalions drawn from 2 separate regiments, each of which had only 2 companies of Grenadiers, hence why there are just 2 patterns shown. For NCOs, it's this rather funky spotted pattern. Always reminds me of a Frisian cow. Enough of that. Gawthor Brown is next. I use this to highlight the dark browns, like the wood on the musket, the leather of the scabbard, and the calfskin of the knapsack. For the latter, I apply the paint with small strokes in an almost dappled effect to create a bit of textural interest. Then, the hair. This will depend of course on whichever base coat you chose. I'm sticking with Gawthor Brown for this figure. Then, with Eshin Grey, I highlight the edges and raised areas on anything black. That being the boots, gaiters, shako cover, chin strap, cartridge pouch, and for Fusiliers, their straps. Using Kislev flash, I pick out a few fine highlights on the skin. Then, the metals. I use Runefang steel for the barrel and bayonet on the musket, plus the buttons on the gaiters, followed by Runelord brass on the bands around the barrel, the butt of the stock, any buttons on the collet, not forgetting that on the shoulder strap and the cuffs, the hilt of the sabre, and the chape at the tip of the scabbard. Almost there. Next we're back to our distinctions. Here's part 2 of that table from earlier. Just like before, match the corresponding highlight colour for the provincial designation on the collar and cuffs, followed by the right colour for the seniority of your chosen regiment on the shoulder straps. Note the difference in highlight colour suggested here for West Prussia versus Brandenburg. But again, if you chose a different base coat for West Prussia in line with some illustrations out there, then you might want to mix your highlight from a combination of, say, Pink Horror with a touch of Screamer Pink. Shoulder straps, by the way, are closer to the poppy red of Brandenburg, it seems, so Wild Rider red it is. This is the same for any turnbacks that are visible on the coat tails. So there we have our completed figure. You'd approach any regular musketeer in exactly the same way, the only step omitted being the gold lace around the cuffs and collar. As for Fusiliers, here's an example with those black straps and the tie around the grey coat that I mentioned. Notice also the lack of a brass badge on the cartridge pouch. and the different shape of the scabbard used for their falchion. But what about the other command figures and their uniform differences, I hear you cry? Well, maybe not, but here are some details on those. The officer wears a silver sash, with tassels to his left, and epaulettes decorated with a metal crescent. The drummer, meanwhile, has a calfskin apron protecting his legs, diagonal bands in the facing colour and white around the hoops of the drum, and swallow nests on his shoulders, again in facing colour, decorated with white lace. In the case of Pomerania, it's white on red as well, since white on white doesn't have quite the same effect. For the flag bearer, the colour of the wooden staff and finial varies from one regiment to the next. Cue another table. I've drawn all the information for this from Stephen Summerfield's book on the Line Infantry, cited on screen now. If you can find it, this is a great purchase. Other uniform books worth looking into for these Prussian line troops are Oliver Schmidt's entry to Osprey's Warrior series, Prussian Regular Infantrymen 1808 to 1815, Peter Hofschrer's entry for their Men-at-Arms series, Prussian Line Infantry 1792 to 1815, and David Nash's book, The Prussian Army 1808 to 1815. Just bear in mind what I said about sword knots earlier, and double check whether any illustrations or diagrams match with the table from the AKO itself, as discussed further in my other video on the topic. Other resources of note are the uniform plates by Richard Knörtel, the plates by his son, Herbert Knörtel and Hans Brauer for the Heer und Tradition series, and the website Mont Saint-Jean, which includes a database of uniforms for every troop type featured during the 100 Days campaign. So here's our figure once more. For me, this method strikes a decent balance between detail and simplicity that I don't mind batch painting across a bunch of figures at a time. If you're only painting up a small handful of miniatures for something like Silver Bayonet, or maybe even a small skirmish force for sharp practice, then you could certainly go a bit further. There are some materials you notice that I just skip highlights on altogether, like the sheath on the greatcoat and the strap on the musket. And things like the skin and metals could receive a lot more attention if you're not dealing with so many figures at a time. But replicated across a whole unit, it does have a nice effect, I think. There'll be plenty more of this kind of video alongside my continuing, more general Napoleonic videos, so do consider subscribing if you're interested in following along with my progress as I work my way through reservists and Landwehr and onto the various types of Prussian cavalry. Thanks for watching, and until next time.